Hi, everyone. I'm Deb Flashenberg. Welcome to Yoga, Birth, Babies, a podcast produced by Prenatal Yoga Center. We will be diving into everything prenatal yoga, birth, and baby related, hoping to inspire, educate, and empower you through your journey into motherhood. Thank you for listening.
Hi, I'm Deb Flashenberg, and I'm your host of Yoga Birth Babies. And today we have a birth story from one of our community members, Cindy Pollock. I loved having Sydney in class. She started very early in her pregnancy, and she was in class. The last class that she took on a Wednesday was the day her water broke. It was 2 days before she was supposed to be induced. So I had the honor and privilege to watch Cindy go through her whole pregnancy. And she shares her birth story. She says something at the end that really struck me as we were talking about kind of the highs and lows and some of the surprises of her birth. We're talking about the role of her care provider and that her care provider was incredibly supportive and that the team and the way they treated her, that made the difference between a dramatic compared to a traumatic birth experience. And I think that is just so noteworthy that birth doesn't have to go exactly as we envisioned for it to still feel empowering. Birth can have its ups and downs, but you don't have to be traumatized by it. You can find it was surprising and had some twists and turns, but still feeling incredibly supported and taken care of by the people around you can really impact how you view your birth. So I'm excited for you to hear Sydney's story. She really shares so much. Let me tell you a little bit about Sydney, because that's going to help you understand part of her birth story. So she is a therapist in private practice, and she specializes with children 0 to 5 and pregnancy postpartum, and she is the mom to her new baby, Abigail. So I didn't actually know that Sydney worked with the pregnant population, the postpartum population as well, throughout our time at PYC together. And what's interesting is I asked her about how having so much knowledge about this population, how that influenced and kind of colored her experience and her lens. So she gives some really wonderful insight. So I think you're going to get so much out of this conversation. Before we get to that, just some things happening at PYC. So we're heading into late winter as you're listening to this, and we're still plugging away at 7 days a week. We have online classes. We have, I think it's maybe 10 or 12 in-person classes for prenatal and postnatal and baby and me. We've got all our workshops in person and online. We have a full online library of on-demand classes that I'm so proud of. It took a bit. It took a vision that I had, and we finally fulfilled having all the workshops that we offer in person, having a component online for on-demand. And it's something I'm really proud of. And then the last thing I want to share is as we're heading into the spring and late spring and summer, we've got 2 more opportunities for teacher training. So we've got an in-studio, in-person training in March and April in New York City. And then we have an online postnatal teacher training. I do it once a year. I absolutely love it. I feel like supporting the postpartum community is not cherished enough and something that I want as many people to have that knowledge as possible. So if you have a thirst to support the perinatal community, check out our website, prenatalyogacenter.com, to find out how to sign up for our trainings. The last thing I want to do is ask you, when you have a moment, would you please leave a rating and review for our podcast? It helps people find us. All right. Thank you so much for being an amazing community. We're going to take a super quick break. When we come back, please enjoy Sydney's birth story. Hi, Sydney. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm so excited to chat with you. I love a good birth story. And yours is fantastic. And one thing I didn't realize until you sent me your bio for our conversation is that you actually work in this field. You work in the whole perinatal field.
I do, yes.
You never disclosed that. That's so
it didn't come up, so.
I guess okay. But I'm curious because as a therapist, specifically for the perinatal period, we're going to dive into this, especially when we talk about birth and postpartum. But I'm so curious to hear how that lens may have kind of colored the way that you were going through. So we'll get there, but I'm so excited to hear about this. All right. So first, let me learn a little bit besides the fact that you're a therapist. Tell me a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah, I'm a therapist, obviously, and this is my first child that I had, and I also have. She's asleep on me. I don't know if you'll hear her noises.
That's okay.
And I live in Manhattan with my 2 dogs and my husband, and now our baby. I don't know what else you want to know.
I actually figured you had dogs because yesterday when you were online for postnatal, I saw you kind of enclosed. I'm like, oh, she's
Yes.
got dogs. And that is why they can't be near her and the baby right now. How's that
Yes.
working out?
It's been good. We actually took or mostly me, like a class on preparing for having a kid and having dogs. And so we were like very careful at first, and they've just been really great. So I'm really grateful because they're big dogs. So
that's a great idea for a class.
Yeah.
I should look into that. All right. So I mentioned you are a therapist specializing in the perinatal period. So how do you think that affected your preparation for pregnancy and postpartum, since you already have such a unique insight into this vulnerable time?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I kind of went into pregnancy, and I think a lot of people around me were like, oh, maybe you know too much, like it's like you're going to think something's wrong all the time. And I think I really had the opposite. Like I was like, I kind of knew what to expect along the way. I mean, not everything, obviously, but I knew like more than I think like your average pregnant person, which I think we should tell pregnant people more stuff too.
Yes.
And like, I think luckily is like, because it's an interest of mine, I was like really excited to be like consuming material. Like I read multiple pregnancy books because I found them interesting, not necessarily like for my own self. So it was kind of like a great professional experience because like I'd never gone through pregnancy before. And like personally, like I loved the experience of it all. So yeah.
What books did you read?
I read Emily Oster's the first 2 books. I read Becoming Mama, which is like one of those week by week ones. I read What to Expect When You're Expecting because someone gave it to me. And Like a Mother, and this pregnancy hacks one that was like a little too general, but yeah, I read a lot of books.
So I do want to ask when we get to the postpartum part of your experience, what that was like coming from a therapist. But I'm also curious, was there anything, so you thought, and I kind of get this too, having been in the birth world well before having a baby, that I thought I knew too much. And then I still had things that really surprised me. And I'm like, I thought I had already been doing that for almost 10 years. And I still had things that I'm like, wow, until I was in the midst of it, I didn't quite get. Did you encounter any of those moments? You're like, I have been supporting people in this period, but wow, this puts a different spin on it.
Yeah, I think actually like the biggest thing that was like a big like moment for me in pregnancy was I had gestational diabetes, and luckily it was like super well maintained. But right after I got diagnosed gestational diabetes, I was like so upset because like it just meant that like I'd have to do things differently and I have to take my blood every day. And there were like no support groups out there for that, or like I couldn't find a support group for like when you have these like minor things or like even some major things like for people. And that I think was really, really sad for me. And I was like, well, that's something I want to like keep in mind as I go forward. Like there needs to be support for things along the way in pregnancy. I think there are a lot of general ones. But yeah, I couldn't believe that there weren't like support groups for things like that, or hypertension, preeclampsia. Yeah.
I do know that there is a preeclampsia foundation. So I would bet they have, and I bet there's a gestational diabetes one too. But these are great that you're bringing that up, put it on everyone's radar. So now that you've went through that yourself, did you find anything? So if a client or patient of yours approaches you with that, you're like, I've got this.
Yeah. Honestly, I was finding a lot of stuff on TikTok, good and bad. TikTok can be a really rough place. Very validating stuff on TikTok, though, being like how upset people were after they found out.
Yeah.
But there is this one person who I found on Instagram who's like a gestational diabetes dietitian, and
is
I
it
found
Lily? Oh,
it's
no.
not Lily.
Okay.
It's someone else. I can send you her info after,
I
but
would love that.
she was great. I feel like it was very non-shamey. A lot of like what you read about gestational diabetes, and that's not what we're here to talk about, but it's very shamey. And it's like, did you eat too many carbs at the beginning of your pregnancy? And like, it has to do with your placental hormones and nothing like that. But even as you're like looking up, like people, like they still kind of have like that tone. And I think she does a great job of kind of like not making it have that tone. And it's about like how you can eat to enjoy yourself and not just like eat no carbs. While
I
also
feel like
doing
what
tricks.
person in their first trimester can stay away from carbs?
Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
most people are so nauseous. All right. So I'm going to circle us back. So let's talk a little bit about how did you prepare yourself for pregnancy and birth? So obviously you have some insight and you came to prenatal yoga a lot. So what else did you do?
Yeah, for pregnancy and birth, I did a lot of reading, and I did like a ton of Googling, which like can also be good or bad. And I spent a lot of time talking to mom friends. I have like a lot of different people in my life who encountered it all very differently. And so I think having a lot of different perspectives is really helpful because I have friends who went through pregnancy and birth and never want to do it again. And one friend who's like, sign me up for 4. Like, it was great. And so I think even though it can be scary to talk to the people who are like, never again, it's helpful to like know what happened and what brought them to that conclusion. So, yeah.
So how did you pick your birth team?
I luckily have been seeing my OB since I moved to New York, like 8 years ago, and she's fantastic. I remember when I got married, she said like something along the lines of like, when people get married, they try and lose a bunch of weight, but then they don't look like themselves. So make sure you look like yourself when you get married. And that was like really validating. I think like she's always been very validating about like weight gain and things like that. And she's like my favorite doctor, which is like often
Who is it?
Dr. Francis at Mount Sinai.
I know Dr. Francis. Yeah.
Yeah. And often like your favorite doctor is not someone who gives you pap smears. But she is. And I referred my friend who was like a year ahead of me having a baby to her. And I was like, because, you know, you see someone as your gynecologist, not the same as being your OB. And she like had an amazing experience, a great birth. And so I felt like really confident going into it. And I trusted Dr. Francis completely. So
that's amazing. So she was one of the main parts of your birth team. Who else was involved?
Really, it was Dr. Francis, the very many people at Mount Sinai who came in. And then my husband was there as well. And he was like a very important part, I think, of my birth team too, because he's very calm and reassuring. And I know we talked about this one time at yoga, like what if your partner or like your husband or spouse is not not the calmest person. And I do feel really lucky that he is.
That sounds amazing. How did he prepare?
He read some books too. And like a lot of like me telling him things. And then he also has some dad friends and they gave him some advice, some that he took and some that he didn't. We talk about being like an informed consumer of the things that people tell us. And so, he kind of parsed through the things that were helpful for him.
Yes, it's very important to have at least somebody in this space that is that calm person. Luckily for you, it was your partner. Other people, it's a doula, but it's so important that not everyone is kind of going crazy. Yeah. All right, so let's hear your birth story.
Yeah, my birth story was not as I had planned. As you know, I saw you the day my water broke for yoga.
It was a Wednesday, right? And then you were supposed to have an induction on a Friday.
I was, yes.
I remember this, yeah.
I saw you and it was my last class because I was being induced on Friday. And so I was just like getting prepared. I'd already stopped working. And then my dog had like a cut. So I was like, well, this is my last chance. Let me take him to the vet and get his cut cleaned up and checked out because I'm not going to take him to the vet for a while afterwards. So I walked him, he's 80 pounds. I walked him 20 blocks each way to and from the vet. And then as I was walking back, I was like, my back hurts a little bit, but that was normal because I was so pregnant. I came home and I went to the bathroom, and then I went and sat on the couch, and then I like stood up really like quickly, and all of a sudden like I was like, did I just pee again? um and I didn't. It was just like, but they say like your water can come as like a trickle or a gush, and mine was a trickle. So my water broke, but I didn't know that yet. I was very confused. And I like went on Reddit and I was like, how do you know if your water breaks? And they said like change your clothes and see like if you're still leaking. So I like did that, which in retrospect just made more clothes dirty, and I wouldn't recommend that because it became pretty obvious that my water was broken. I like texted my husband who was at work. I was like, I think my water broke. And he's like, you think? And I was like, yes, I think. I called my doctor, and then I waited for like 45 minutes for him to get home and my mom to come to get the dogs. And then she drove us to the hospital. And so we got to the hospital, which I'd never been to like the hospital part before. So we didn't know where we were going, and I'm leaking amniotic fluid. It's very uncomfortable. And we get to the waiting room, and they gave me some forms, and I was like, why didn't I fill these out prior to birth? But that's okay. And so I'm like standing up trying to fill out these forms, and the nurse comes out and she's like, you're not in active labor, right? And I was like, well, I'm actively like dripping. And she's like, oh, okay, come with me. And she like brought me to the back, and they like triaged me. And they were like, well, like we have to check if your water broke. And I was like, I feel like it's pretty obvious at this point. And so like they checked me, and I was only like 1 centimeter dilated. And so
were you having contractions?
Not that I could feel. So like on the way to the hospital, I was like so anxious because this was not the plan, right? Like I was like, I'm being induced in 2 days. What do you mean my water broke? And so I like had those like mild period cramp, but I was like, is this just stress? And then when they hooked me up to the contraction monitor, they said they could see like little contractions. I think I started to feel them like around the time I was in like the triage, but they were very mild. So I had learned actually earlier that week from my sister-in-law that when your water breaks, they give you like only a set amount of time to get the baby out because it's like a different risk factor. And so the doctor came in and said, not my doctor yet, but like the doctor who was there said, like, do you want to take Pitocin to like speed it along? And since I was planning to be induced that Friday, I was like, yeah, we just moved this up 48 hours and give me the Pitocin, but I want the epidural first. And so, yeah, then they moved me to like a delivery room, and we were in there for a little bit when like the anesthesiologist came with the epidural. And at that point I was definitely like having some like period cramp contractions that I could feel for sure. And I loved the epidural. I thanked the anesthesiologist. I told him he was excellent at his job. I was like very happy to have my epidural. I should also say we were starving. I wouldn't let my husband eat before we got to the hospital because I was like, no, I just need to go. Like this is happening right now. And I kind of knew that they wouldn't let you eat when you got there, but I regret not eating. And so we had packed snacks too, but I was like too anxious to eat them. So we were like starving. So my husband went to go get food for himself. And I was like chatting with the nurse, and I was like asking how long it takes, like usually for like labor to progress, you know, as a personal, like how long is this going to take? And also like from a professional, like how long does this usually take kind of question. And
what was her answer?
She said, she was very funny. She was like, it takes a long time to get until 6. And then once you're 6 centimeters dilated, it goes way faster.
Yeah.
And so I was like, okay, well, I'm 1 centimeter dilated and we'll see how this goes. And they hadn't given me the Pitocin yet. And like, luckily my husband came back before they came to start it. And so at like, I think around 11 o'clock, it's pretty blurry time wise. We got to the hospital around like 6. So like around 11 o'clock, they gave me the Pitocin. And it was very shortly after that like we were just chatting with the nurse. She was so calm. And she was like, she said something into her like little like walkie talkie, and all of these like doctors came like rushing in. It was like 7 doctors, and they were like, the heart rate is dropping for my baby, not me. And like, they were like, turn onto your side, turn onto your other side, go on all fours. They gave me like a shot to stop the contractions. And they stopped the Pitocin. And it was really scary. I think that was like the scariest moment of it all. I like couldn't even see what was happening because I was on all fours, like we were in yoga. And they put like an internal monitor on her head. And so like they got her heart rate back up, and it was like all calm, and it was like just the nurse, my husband and I in the room. And then like she kind of explained to us, so like no one told us really what was happening when it was happening. They were just like really focused on making sure everything was okay. And then like they kind of explained a little bit, but I have no idea what they said because I was freaking out. And the nurse kind of explained a little bit.
So what did the nurse say?
I don't really remember what she said. I think she said like the heart rate was dropping, but it's like back now. Like they didn't offer an explanation. They did explain things like as we were, like when they gave me the shot, they were like, this might make your heart rate go up a little bit, which it didn't. And things like that. But they didn't really, I don't think they knew what was going on, which made it like more scary, right? You go from like talking to the nurse about like something so minor to like 7 doctors rushing in, flipping you around. And I had epidural, right? So like flipping up and down and side to side.
It took some people. It wasn't so easy.
Yes. And so I was really, and then like the nurse left, but like then it was just me and my husband, and I was like really scared, and like we were both crying a little bit. And that was like, like one of your questions from before was about like things I used to get through that. Like that was a moment of like a lot of deep breathing, a lot of like, it's going to be okay. Everything's okay right now. Like telling myself and like calming myself down, but it was hard. And then I had to stay on all fours for like a good amount of time to make sure she like regulated. So I was really happy to have done all that yoga to prepare me for being in that position. But yeah, so I said to my husband that I was like, I'm really scared. He was like, I'm scared too. And like, we kind of just like held hands in this like awkward position. And then a little while later, like after it had been some time, the nurse came back in and helped me get back to the original position I was in, because that was like how she was like the most happy inside of me, I guess, in that, because I was still having some contractions. So I was like on my side. And so I kind of stayed like that for a while. And at some point, the epidural was like uneven, and I was feeling contractions really on my left side. And so she tried to help me move to my left side. No, she tried to help me move flat so that it would be more even. And then shortly after that, without the Pitocin, her heart rate dropped again. And so like the doctors came rushing back in. Maybe there were like 5 of them this time, not all 7. They stopped the contractions. They got me on all fours. They checked me. I think I was like 3 centimeters dilated at that point. So I was nowhere close to 10. And the heart rate went back to normal. And I was on all fours again. And so then it happened twice, with the Pitocin and without the Pitocin. So then we were kind of like, this is scary. The nurse like came back in and like flipped me back to the side that was safe. And then they were like, just stay on this side and let's not do anything else right now. And then at like 4 a.m, my OB came in, and she was like, hey guys, how's it going? And I was like, hey, and I like hadn't really been sleeping because I was so worried. And she was like, she had, at this point, she's the first person to say to us, like, I think the cord is wrapped around her. And when you have strong contractions, like with the Pitocin, it's like causing her some distress. And so like she had a reason why. And so she said, let's see if we can get you like more dilated. Like we're going to use the peanut ball to sort of like prop my legs in a certain position, but stay on that same safe side and see like how far we can get. Which was like, she has such like a good attitude to her that
I love that she pulled the peanut ball in. Can I tell you that so many care provider, again, mark of a really good care provider,
Mhm.
that she wasn't just like, let's just do a section. The fact that
Right.
she had tools to help
Mhm.
you with the path that you were intending. I love that. All right, we're going to take a super quick break. When we come back, let's pick up with the amazing Dr. Francis and the peanut ball. Okay, we'll be right back. Okay, we're back. So, Dr. Francis came in,
Mhm.
gave you the lowdown. You now have a peanut ball helping to open your pelvis so
I
baby
do.
can find its way down. Take it from there.
Yeah, so she gave me the peanut ball, and I stayed like that for like a while. My legs were pretty numb, but like the nurse was also great. She like helped readjust me a few times, but like really had to stay on that one side. And so I don't think it happened again that like her heart rate dropped in that moment, but it had happened twice. So it was, so we were staying very conservative and like I hadn't really dilated much from there. And then like I would say sometime in the morning, Dr. Francis came back in, checked on me. She was like, so we're not really progressing. And so we have a few choices. She said, your first choice is that we could try the Pitocin again and see if it can get us further and hopefully like her heart rate won't drop. Or second choice is that we could move to a C-section. Right. And so my husband was like, well, is there any risk to Sydney, to the baby? And she was like, no. So the good thing is that every time her heart rate dropped, the baby's, it came back so fast. And she's like, and that is not like common. Like usually there's like some recovery, but it was literally like drop and then back up as soon as I got into the right position. So she's like, I'm not really worried about the baby. And then my husband asked about my safety. And she was like, oh no, Sydney's been fine the whole time. Like if there was any risk to her, we would have done the C-section a while ago. And so she was like, you think about it, but like my preference is that we try again and see what happens before we move to a C-section. And so we talked about it and we were like, okay, well, if there's very little to no risk, then let's try the Pitocin again. Like we know we can come back from it. And so she was like, okay, great. So we did the Pitocin again. And she also walked us through, I don't remember if it was then or later, what a C-section would entail from start to finish too, because if there was something that went wrong and it was an emergency C-section, it was good to know what was going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were like, all right, so we're going to start the Pitocin. So we started it and I made it, I would say like 30 minutes this time on the Pitocin before like they had to come turn it off because her heart rate was dropping. Also at this point, my husband could monitor her heart rate. Like he knew where it was on all the machines and stuff. And so like he was watching too. And I couldn't see because I was on the other side. And I still had the peanut ball going too. And so we made it 30 minutes and then her heart rate dropped again. So they turned the Pitocin off. She was actually like quickly rebounded without me going on all fours that time. And so then like a little while later, my OB came back in and she was like, all right, well, we tried, thinking like, we're moving on to a C-section now. And so we like talked more about what a C-section would entail, how long it takes, and so on and so forth. And she's like, my team is getting prepped outside. And then she's like, let me just check if you're dilated just to see. And so she checked me and she was like, oh my gosh, you've got to be kidding me. She's like, you're fully dilated. So here I am, like prepped to go to a C-section. And I'm just like, all right. She's like, let's push. And I was like, oh, okay, we're pushing now. And so she and the nurse, and then my husband didn't know he would be like holding a leg. And so I like pushed for not very long. And then she was like, there's a little lip. I think you're like 9.5 centimeters dilated. So like, let's wait like 30 more minutes and then we'll push because you'll probably be fully dilated. And I forgot to say too, she had walked us through that if her heart rate dropped and she was like mostly out, that they would use the vacuum to get her out too. We talked about like risk with that, and it still seemed like worth it and fine. And so I pushed for like 30 to 45 minutes. So it was pretty quick when she came back and we started pushing again. And then she had to use the vacuum to get her out, but it was like so fast and she was fine. And then she like held her up and she was like, the cord was wrapped around her leg and her arm and maybe around her a third time. She's like, you have a really long umbilical cord. Like you must have had a very active baby. And someone had said to me, like, my baby was not as active, like that theirs wasn't as active as I'm saying. Like she was constantly moving. And it was like distracting a lot of the time. And like, she wasn't very big. She was 6 pounds, 10 ounces, but she always had her foot like jammed into my rib cage. And so it was a lot of movement. And then she was like, I'm going back to when she came out, my OB was like, I need to have a talk with this baby about the stress that she brought to all of us. And so she was funny. And then obviously we did our skin to skin too. And yeah, it was like
she lassoed herself through your umbilical cord. I love that.
She did. Yeah. She was like really wrapped up in there. But like, luckily she was able to make her way out. But I think at some point she explained that like when those strong contractions happen and like the umbilical cord is around them, like it really stresses them out. So yeah. And it was like crazy to learn that it was wrapped around her not once, but at least twice, maybe 3 times. So,
oh my gosh. Did your husband see it? When
he did.
How much? Oh my gosh.
Yeah, he saw it all. That was not the plan. We were always like by the head kind of people. But I think by the time we like got to the end, like we just wanted this baby out, you know, like we didn't care about anything. Like I didn't realize till like a week later that when I was like on like hands and knees, that like my butt was just like in the air the whole time. Like you don't think about those things. But it was really crazy to think about after the fact. So
I love that she spent the time to explain everything while it was calm, because if you were trying to take this in during like them running you down the hall, that would just add to the anxiety. So I love that she had that foresight while things were calm to give you the pros and cons and not just being like, this is best. Like she gave you the whole thing. I do have a question. Since you were mainly laboring on your side because that was best for your baby and the multiple times the umbilical cord. How did you push? Were you on your side or did they put you on your back for that?
I was on my back for pushing. So yeah, once we're doing this and she's coming out, then I think the concern was just like getting her out, which is why they used the vacuum, was like, cause her heart rate had dropped again. And so that's why they used the vacuum. But yeah, so I pushed on my back, which like I know is like, as we talked about a lot, like sometimes not the most ideal pushing position, but I
was just curious because it showed like she was happier on the side. So I was wondering if the care provider's like, let's try to keep you on your side. But she came out. It sounds like she came out well on your back.
She did. Yes. I was so happy when she came out.
So as you were heading into your labor, of course, not knowing what was coming up, for you, all those kind of bumpy moments. Had you thought ahead of time of some of your coping skills? Because I know that you talked about the epidural was going to be before even having the Pitocin. So you had more of a comfort coping skill in that way. But had you thought about some of the other ones that you end up utilizing? Like, did you have a plan with your husband about, okay, if I get anxious, let's try this or any of that?
Yeah, I shared with him a lot of the mantras we talked about in class. I actually, when I was like really pregnant at the end and I had to like go uphill or like walk up steps, like he and I would say to each other, like, I can do hard things.
Yes.
And so like that was definitely a big one. I'm a really big deep breathing person. I know it's not for everyone, but I know for me, like I hold a lot of like tension in my like body. And when I'm stressed, like it really comes out in my body. And so like as much deep breathing as I can, I teach a lot of deep breathing. So I feel like that helps a lot too. So yeah, that, and just like, I'm really, really big on talking about your feelings when you feel them. So like when I was scared the first time, like saying to him, like, I'm really scared, and having him validate that he was me and saying he was scared too was like really important for me. So yeah, those are like, I think the biggest things.
It's funny, as you were saying that, I had this image because you always were in the same spot in the room, near the window in the front area.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'm always scanning how the students are doing. And whenever we did what I would say kind of hard things, you often either had your eyes closed if it was safe to balance that way, or at a soft gaze. And it's funny you say you hold a lot of tension. Oh,
Mm-hmm.
actually, that's true. I do remember sometimes your shoulders were hiked up and I'm like, relax your shoulders. But you do use your breath in such a way that your body actually responds so quickly. Like I remember seeing the tension, the breath, the release, and a really soft face.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing how you committed to that work. And then it sounds like it was able to show up when you needed it.
Yeah, I do think, I mean, I work a lot with like kids. That's my other specialty. And I know that if you say like, have you tried deep breathing? They're like, that doesn't work. And even adults feel that way too. But I think like the more you can train yourself to use that in stressful moments, like the better it'll happen in a stressful moment, right? Like it's really hard to stop and say like, let me try deep breathing because like no one wants to, your heart's racing. You don't want to do that in that moment. Like it's very counterintuitive, but the more you practice doing it automatically, like the more you don't even realize you're doing it. So I was taking the deep breath and I was like, okay, like my brain came after my body. So
that's like what we talk about in class, that we keep doing it and doing it and doing it. And then it just becomes part of us.
right.
We just practice. I love that. So how's postpartum been?
Postpartum has been a ride.
Share.
I think like healing wise, I had mentioned to you like the first time I saw you afterwards that like I had a hard time and I have had a hard time with breastfeeding. It's gotten better. But that kind of like, if you look at it like a glass half full kind of thing, like my pain with breastfeeding kind of trumped all my other healing pain. So I didn't notice my other healing until after it was like all done. I was like, oh, okay, like I had a pretty smooth recovery because I'm so focused on breastfeeding. So take what you can. And then I would say like there's been lots of challenges. I don't know if you can hear her snoring. There's been some challenges and there's been like some really great moments. I think like I'm still on maternity leave, but we were really anxious for my husband to return to work. Because then I was going to be alone with her all day and it was hard. But as we've moved along, it's gotten a little bit better and there are still hard days. Obviously, today was starting off as one of the hard days, but we've been in a nap this whole call. So that's great. And then there were also just like, I've read a lot about like just those moments of your hormones and you're just like crying hysterically for no reason. And I definitely had those, but I think also knowing that they're normal really helps too. Like I was like, this is what's happening from an academic standpoint. I am having like extreme hormonal crying for like a few minutes that I don't even feel sad. And then like I felt better and it felt really good to know that was like regular. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Would you share some of the things you said? You had some challenges, but then you had some beautiful moments. Do you mind sharing some of the challenges and the beautiful moments?
Yeah. So I think most of my challenges are related to breastfeeding in the beginning. We know now she probably has a tongue tie, but she's gaining weight. At first she wasn't gaining weight. And so like, I'm a perfectionist. And so I was like, oh no, like how do I get my baby to gain weight? And then like after a week, she like more than made up for her lack of weight gain. And so like that felt great too. The pediatrician was like, wow, you're doing amazing as parents. And like, we really needed that. I would say like she was very sleepy in the beginning and I work with kids. I love kids. So I like really enjoyed being with her. And then when she became like a little bit more alert and a little bit fussier, it was just like, how do I get my child to be calm was really hard. But then like once I did it, I was like, oh, I can soothe my own child, which was like great to feel, right? Like the first time I did it, I was like, yes, I did it. Because my husband did a lot of the soothing at the beginning when I was like resting. And then I would say like right around the time that my husband was going back to work and she was becoming like a little bit more awake around like 6 to 8 weeks. And it was like a little bit harder because I had to like do things with her besides like feed her and get her to sleep, she started smiling. And so it came at like the perfect time to get like that feedback. So she started smiling at strangers first, but I'll take it. And now she smiles at us all the time, which is lovely. So
it's where they go from being what I call a little meatloaf to like a little person. And it feels so good.
Yeah.
So going back to something I asked when we're talking more about pregnancy. So what surprised you about postpartum, especially coming from a background of working with the postpartum population?
Yeah, I would say the thing that surprised me most about postpartum is that I feel like a lot of people were really like attentive at the beginning and like really wanted to help. And then how quickly that kind of faded away. And like I knew it and like it was hard to experience it. And I would say like my friends who are moms check on me the most. And my friends who aren't parents kind of like stopped asking a few weeks after, which is like a weird experience to be like, I'm still like really in the throes of postpartum. And like, I feel like I had no one to talk to if they hadn't already gone through it.
Which is probably why you signed up for the new parent support group. I think that, first of all, I love that you did that because even though you are a therapist, there is something about being in it with other people and feeling like you don't have to have your academic hat on. You could have I'm a mom, let's support each other. I'm having bumps too. So I love that you did that. Okay, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, what is one tip or piece of advice you would like to offer new and expectant parents? We'll be right back. We are back. All right. So what is one tip or piece of advice you'd like to offer new and expectant parents?
I guess my biggest tip taking away from like my birth story is that you have to trust and like your provider. I met like a bunch of people who were not sure or had like not great vibes with their provider. And I think this could have gone very differently for me if I didn't have such great trust in her. And I know people who have had like similar birth stories and then had C-sections, and then ones who had different birth stories and had C-sections. And I think that having like trust in your provider can make a difference between like sometimes coming out with like being like, wow, that was really dramatic, or like coming out and being like, that was really traumatic. And so I think that's like a big takeaway for me is like, I feel really grateful for the care I received. And I want that for other people too.
Yeah, it absolutely sounds like when you needed the support, she was there. In fact, it sounds like they all were there, that the nurse so quietly, instead of making you panic that something was wrong, got the team in, and that when things looked, a little up in the air, that your care provider was just so supportive of you. You're totally right. The care provider and how you're treated and respected can make a huge difference. Thank you for sharing that. So even though we weren't planning kind of going this way, but people now know that you are a perinatal specialist as a therapist. What if they're hearing this and they're thinking, wow, I can relate to this person. I might want to work with her. Where can people find your work?
They can find me through my website. I don't have like Instagram or any social media or anything, but I'm happy to chat with anyone through my website. So.
Do you want to share your website?
Yeah, it's my name, Sydney Pollock, lcsw.com.
Perfect. I will make sure we have that in the show notes. Sydney, I had such a great time chatting with you. I loved having you in class. I loved seeing you in postnatal, and I love that you came online when you couldn't make it to postnatal even. And next time, though, let's see your dogs online because I'm very curious to see what they look like. You said
I'd love to see you too.
Thank you, Sydney.
This has been an episode of Yoga Birth Babies, produced by Prenatal Yoga Center. You can catch us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Periscope. I'm Deb Flaschenberg. Thanks for listening.